On a frozen street, a stray dog is beaten again and again, yet it refuses to move, standing between evil and a newborn left to die. The attackers laugh, until a lone Navy SEAL steps out of the snow, realizing this isn't chance, it's a test. One choice will expose a hidden crime, betray powerful men, and risk everything to save the innocent. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Snow had stopped, but winter still ruled the road. Silent drifts, brittle streetlights, and a city holding its breath. Ryan Carter walked alone through the white hush when a sudden thud and a thin newborn cry split the darkness. Ryan didn't like cities in winter. They felt like a lie told with clean lines, plowed sidewalks, polished storefronts, cheerful lights, while something feral prowled just behind the glass. The cold made everything honest. It stripped noise from the air and left only what was true, the scrape of boots, the rasp of breath, the simple arithmetic of distance and time. In the teams, Ryan had trusted numbers. In civilian life, numbers didn't keep anyone alive. A phone might die, a stranger might watch, a uniform might mean nothing. And lately, the quiet inside his own head had been louder than gunfire. He was 25 and already tired in a way that had no clean story to tell. Not war-weary, not broken, just worn thin, like a rope that held only because it remembered tension. He wore his working uniform because it obeyed. Fabric and seams didn't ask who he was now. They didn't care that his sense of purpose had started to fray at the edges. The sound came again, impact, a curse, then a sharp yelp that didn't belong to a man. Ryan slowed, not sprinting. Sprinting was for bullets. This felt uglier, intimate, the kind of violence that existed because no one was watching. He turned down the side street where snow had piled into uneven ridges and parked cars crouched under white caps. Under a flickering street lamp, two men stood over something low to the ground. Their movements were careless, almost bored. Then he saw it clearly. A stray shepherd dog wedged between the curb and a half-buried stroller. Inside the stroller, a newborn cried weakly, the sound thin and unsteady. The dog stood between the men and the child, body angled like a shield, not dramatic, not loud, just immovable. A boot slammed into its side. The dog staggered, recovered, and growled again, lower now, as if saying the only truth it knew, "You can hurt me, but you will not pass." Ryan felt the familiar surge inside his chest, training, anger, instinct, followed immediately by the thought he hated most: keep walking. The cost of stopping was always higher than it looked. He swallowed and kept moving forward. "Step back," he said calmly. Calm carried weight. Calm meant he wasn't asking. The men turned, smirking when they saw the uniform. One laughed and reached for the stroller handle. The dog lunged, snapping at the wrist. The man recoiled and kicked harder. Ryan stepped in. No flourish, no rage, just efficient motion. A shove, a twist, a loss of balance. The second man swung. Ryan ducked, redirected, ended it. Enough. The word landed like a wall. The men backed off, cursing, pride bruised, disappearing into the dark. The street fell quiet again, trembling. The stroller rocked slightly. Ryan approached slowly. The dog snapped its head toward him, eyes bright, body tensing, stepping in front of the stroller again. The growl sharpened. This was not madness. This was instinct sharpened into law. Ryan crouched, hands open, letting the cold soak into his knees. "Hey," he murmured, "I'm not here to take anything." The dog didn't move. Blood dotted the snow. Ryan felt a sudden, bitter shame that the world required this animal to be braver than most people. He glanced into the stroller. The newborn's face was pinched by cold, breath shallow, a damp blanket. Someone had tried once, or maybe they had run out of courage? Ryan's thoughts fractured, memories pressing in, other nights, other cold, other cries. He forced himself back. He breathed the way he had been taught. "I'm going to help the baby," he whispered to the dog. "And you, I need you to let me." The dog took one step forward, muzzle inches from Ryan's face, breath hot and ragged. The choice hung there, heavy. Ryan didn't flinch. "You're not alone," he said softly, surprising himself. The growl lowered. The dog shifted just enough to allow a narrow angle, trust, imperfect and fragile. Ryan adjusted the blanket, wrapped the newborn in his jacket. The baby cried, alive. Relief hit him so hard his chest hurt. The dog watched every movement, body still blocking, but allowing. No houses lit up. No neighbors came. The city looked away. Ryan pushed the stroller under a bus stop shelter, blocking the wind, checking breath and color again and again. The dog lay down beside it, eyes never leaving the child, pain and resolve braided together. On the ride out of the city, Ryan kept watching the animal, understanding without words that this loyalty wasn't trained. It was older than commands. When they reached the cabin, he built a fire, set the baby in a basket lined with towels, and cleaned the dog's wounds with careful hands. The dog endured, as if pain were simply part of duty. Ryan sat back, thinking of the road he almost didn't stop on, of how close the world had come to erasing this moment. He dug through an old duffel and found a ceremonial K9 service collar, something symbolic he'd kept without knowing why. He knelt and held it out. The dog stiffened, then lowered its head. Acceptance, not submission. Ryan fastened it gently and spoke the name as if it had always been there. Valor. The dog exhaled, a long breath, burden easing. Ryan rested his forehead against the dog's head for a brief second and made a quiet vow he knew would cost him everything. He would not let the world take what this animal had bled to protect. A gray winter morning pressed against the cabin windows as sirens replaced the forest's silence, and the city drew closer, cold and watchful. Ryan Carter watched the newborn sleep in fitful starts while the fire burned low, each tiny breath landing like a responsibility he had not asked for, but could not refuse. Valor lay near the door, alert without pacing, a presence that felt like a question waiting for an answer. When the knock came, Ryan's stomach tightened before his mind caught up. He had expected it. He always did. The world had a way of finding people who tried to disappear. The visitor introduced himself as a local officer, and after a beat that felt too measured to be casual, as an old acquaintance. Ryan recognized him then, a friend from years ago, before everything hardened, before Ryan learned that uniforms could lie. The officer's eyes went to the basket, then to Valor, then back to Ryan with something like relief, and something like calculation. The explanation came quickly, almost rehearsed. The infant matched a missing child alert, 2 weeks old, family wealthy, pressure high. Ryan felt a dull ache behind his eyes. 2 weeks was a long time for a baby to survive the cold without help. He agreed to go to the station because saying no would only make noise, and noise had never saved anyone. The ride into town felt longer than the distance allowed, every red light an accusation. Valor stayed close, reading the tension without understanding its source, a loyal silence that steadied Ryan even as doubt crept in. At the station, the air smelled of coffee and metal and impatience. Forms appeared. Voices softened when the child was mentioned, then sharpened when Ryan's name was run. He answered questions without embellishment, keeping his words clean. When the cuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound was louder than it should have been. He had expected suspicion, not restraint, and the mismatch rattled him. The explanation was procedural, the tone apologetic, but procedure had never put steel on his bones before. Through the glass, he saw them arrive. The father moved like someone accustomed to being believed, dressed in certainty. The mother followed half a step behind, eyes down, clothes worn thin, in ways that told a story no one was asking her to tell. Ryan's pulse thudded. Something was wrong, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet alignment of power. No one asked how the baby survived. No one asked why a stray dog would bleed for a child that was not its own. The room felt tilted. Ryan searched the mother's face for a signal and found fear there, raw and unhidden, the kind that made him remember a night overseas when a witness would not speak until the wrong man left the room. The father spoke softly and often, gratitude threaded with authority, while the mother said nothing at all. Ryan tried to catch her eye and failed. When he did just once, her gaze flicked to Valor and back, a movement so small it could have been nothing, except that it was not. Time stretched. A supervisor appeared. The cuffs came off with a sentence about insufficient grounds and cooperation appreciated. Ryan understood the translation immediately. He was being released because holding him would draw attention they did not want. He was being released because he was useful, free. The father shook his hand, thanked him publicly, promised to follow up. The mother did not look at him. Valor's attention never left the child until the door closed between them. The emptiness that followed hit Ryan harder than the metal had. Outside, Winter breathed on his neck again. The officer who had brought him in avoided his eyes now, speaking of misunderstandings and paperwork, a practiced retreat. Ryan nodded and said nothing. Words would not help. Back at the cabin, the quiet felt altered, as if the walls had learned a new language while he was gone. Valor paced once, then stopped, ears angled toward the tree line, not frightened, but unsettled. Ryan washed his hands and stood there longer than necessary, staring at nothing, replaying the station in his head. He told himself to let it go. He told himself he had done what he could. He told himself that walking away was not the same as abandoning. None of it landed. He thought of the mother's eyes and the father's confidence, and the way the cuffs had felt like a suggestion rather than a sentence. He thought of the cost of being noticed. He thought of how easily the truth could be folded and filed. When night came early, Valor's alertness sharpened, a low unease vibrating through the cabin like a warning hum. Ryan checked the locks without knowing why. He stepped outside once and felt the sense of being observed, not close, not immediate, but present. He dismissed it as nerves, then hated himself for the lie. Before sleep, he reached into the pocket of the jacket he had worn to the station and found the paper. It had not been there before. The message was simple, uneven, desperate. Save the baby. His heart slowed to a dangerous calm. He folded the note and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to Valor breathe, understanding that being released had never meant being safe, only that the game had begun, and somewhere someone was counting on him to move next. A hard night settled over the cabin as wind pressed against the trees, and the city's distant glow faded, leaving only snow, shadow, and the sense that something had already decided to come. Ryan Carter sat at the small table, the note unfolded beneath his palm like a verdict that refused to explain itself. Save the baby. The words were uneven, urgent, written by a hand that had shaken or been forced to move quickly, and their simplicity gnawed at him more than any threat ever had. He replayed the station in his head, the cuffs, the gratitude that sounded rehearsed, the mother's eyes dropping at the wrong moment, the way Valor had stiffened when the doors closed and the child disappeared. Ryan had learned to separate fear from intuition, but this felt like neither. It felt like gravity. Valor paced the length of the cabin once, then stopped, listening with a patience that bordered on sorrow. The dog's loyalty was not loud. It did not ask permission. It simply existed, a steady pressure that reminded Ryan of the promises he used to make to himself when he still believed in clean endings. He folded the note and slid it into his pocket, telling himself to sleep, telling himself to wait for daylight, telling himself that charging at ghosts had gotten good men buried. Sleep did not come. The cabin creaked. The fire sighed. At some point near midnight, Valor's posture changed, not into alarm, but into readiness, the kind that came from recognizing a pattern rather than a sound. Ryan reached for his jacket without thinking, and in that movement he understood that the choice had already been made, not by the note, not by the station, but by the quiet refusal in his chest to let this pass. The knock came without warning, sharp and deliberate, the kind meant to assert presence rather than request entry. Ryan did not answer it immediately. He stood still, counting breaths, listening to Valor's low rumble, a contained storm that waited for release. When the knock came again, closer to a demand, Ryan opened the door enough to see two figures standing in the snow, faces shadowed by hoods, boots planted as if the ground belonged to them. He recognized them at once, not by features, but by posture, by the familiar arrogance of men who had never been told no in a way that mattered. They smiled like they had rehearsed friendliness in a mirror. One spoke first, casual, almost respectful, praising Ryan for doing the right thing at the station, for helping a family reunite. The words slid over Ryan without sticking. Valor stepped forward, placing himself between Ryan and the men, not attacking, simply occupying space that did not belong to them. The second man reached inside his coat and produced a bundle wrapped in plastic, heavy enough to sag in his hand. Money made a dull sound when it hit the cabin floor, an offering laid down with the confidence of people who had learned the world's price list. "Don't get involved in other people's problems," the first man said, voice still pleasant. "The city is dangerous. Accidents happen." Ryan felt the heat rise in his neck, not rage, not yet, but something colder, something that remembered how easily good intentions were bought and sold in places like this. Valor tensed, a single step from violence, and Ryan lifted a hand without looking at the dog. Not yet. He bent, picked up the bundle, and tossed it back into the snow. The money split, bills scattering like pale leaves. "Get off my property," Ryan said. The pleasantness vanished. The men's faces hardened, insult replacing charm. They said nothing more because threats were unnecessary when they believed the threat already existed. They turned and walked away, leaving footprints that filled with snow almost immediately, as if the night were eager to erase them. Ryan closed the door and leaned his forehead against the wood, exhaling slowly. Valor relaxed a fraction, confusion rippling through him like a question without words. Ryan crouched and met the dog's gaze, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper. This wasn't over. It hadn't even started. The hours that followed were thin and sharp. Ryan checked the perimeter, found nothing he could name, and hated the absence more than he would have hated proof. He sat at the table again, turning the note over, studying the pressure of the pen, the slight tear at the corner where it had been folded too many times. He thought about the mother and the way fear could turn a person into furniture in their own life. He thought about power and how it hid behind generosity. He thought about the baby's cry, the way it had quieted when warmth returned, the simple truth that children recognize safety long before adults did. Valor watched him, eyes reflecting the firelight, a presence that asked no questions and demanded no explanations. Ryan realized then that the dog's past, whatever it had been, had taught it the same lesson his own past had taught him. Protection was not a concept, it was an action, repeated until it became identity. Just before dawn, Valor froze, head angled toward the trees. Ryan followed the line of attention and saw nothing, but the sense of being observed returned, stronger now, like a fingertip pressing into the space between his shoulder blades. He stepped outside, breath fogging, and listened. Far off, a vehicle engine passed and faded. The woods held their silence. He returned inside and found his hand shaking as he poured water, a betrayal that annoyed him more than it should have. He remembered a night years ago when a local elder had warned him about roads that only looked empty, about debts that waited patiently. He had laughed then, young enough to believe skill could outrun consequence. He did not laugh now. By mid-morning, the decision crystallized. Waiting would only make him predictable. The note was a clock. The bribe was a test. The station had been a stage. Someone wanted him cautious, contained, useful in his restraint. Ryan packed lightly, not to leave, but to move. He took a longer look at Valor, who stood ready without prompting, as if the dog understood that whatever came next would require proximity, not distance. Ryan knelt and pressed his forehead briefly to Valor's collar, the metal cool and grounding. "We don't rush," he admitted aloud, more to himself than to the dog. "But we don't hide either." Valor's tail moved once, restrained approval. Ryan stepped to the window and looked toward the direction of the city, imagining the clean lines of wealth, the gates that kept danger out by defining it as other. Somewhere beyond those lines was a woman who could not speak and a child who could not choose. Somewhere a schedule was being kept. Ryan closed the curtain and turned back to the room, understanding with a calm that surprised him that the next move would not be loud, not yet, but it would be deliberate, and it would begin with following the trail that money always left behind. A pale winter afternoon settled over the city's edges as guarded streets led toward wealth behind gates, snow, crusted and quiet, the kind of calm that hid movement rather than peace. Ryan Carter drove without hurry, the cabin's isolation replaced by the geometry of affluence, and he felt the familiar shift inside him from defense to observation, the old discipline returning as his breathing steadied and his thoughts lined up. The note stayed folded in his pocket like a second pulse, not loud enough to dictate action, but present enough to deny denial. Valor rode close, not restless, simply attentive, reading the city's currents the way Ryan read rooms, both of them shaped by past lessons that said, danger rarely announced itself honestly. The mansion rose behind its barriers with the confidence of something used to being untouched. Guards posted not as protection, but as punctuation, reminding passers-by where sentences ended. Ryan did not approach the gate. He waited, counting patterns, watching the guards exchange looks, watching the way service entrances swallowed people without acknowledgement. He remembered a case years earlier when a witness had only spoken after being seen by someone who did not belong, and he wondered if presence alone could be a lever. When the mother appeared, the truth of the station fell back into place with sickening clarity. She moved with permission rather than agency, flanked by men whose attention never left her hands, whose spacing kept her contained without contact. Ryan felt a familiar anger tighten his jaw, not explosive, but precise. He followed at a distance as she was driven toward the market, a public place chosen for its noise, its plausible deniability, its exits. Valor's posture shifted, the low awareness of a creature that recognized choreography meant to distract. At the market, the air filled with small collisions and louder voices, the music of commerce swelling to cover intent. A commotion erupted near a vendor, a staged argument that drew guards like iron filings to a magnet. Ryan did not rush. He stepped into the slipstream created by the diversion and found himself beside the mother before either of them fully accepted the improbability of it. He said her name softly, a question rather than a demand, and felt the tremor that ran through her when she realized someone had chosen her over the spectacle. She did not look at Valor at first, then she did, and the recognition there was almost unbearable. They walked as if they belonged together, the oldest trick, conversation kept mundane, bodies angled away from the noise. Ryan spoke without preamble, because preamble wasted time and courage. He told her he knew something was wrong. He told her he believed her child was not safe. He told her he could not promise safety, only effort. She answered with a breath she had been holding for weeks. Words spilled, controlled at first, then faster, the truth pushing past the fear that had trained her to silence. She said the ship would leave tonight, that schedules were fixed when money demanded obedience, that children were cargo disguised as paperwork, that she had tried to warn someone once and learned what warnings cost. Her hands shook when she pressed the small drive into Ryan's palm, the weight of it incongruous, ordinary, dangerous. She said it held images she had taken in secret, transactions and faces, and a calendar that did not forgive delay. She said the father wanted it and had promised consequences if she failed. Ryan closed his fingers around the drive and felt the calm settle deeper, the kind that arrived when ambiguity ended. Valor's attention flicked toward the perimeter, sensing the guards return before Ryan saw them, a subtle shift that saved seconds. They separated without drama, the mother swallowed by the crowd as the guards reclaimed their formation, the diversion collapsing back into noise. Ryan did not look back. He walked until the market thinned and the city resumed its careful breathing, until the mansion's influence loosened its grip on the air. In the car, he did not start the engine immediately. He sat, hands resting, mind measuring the distance between now and tonight, between action and consequence. The USB felt heavier than any weapon he had carried because it demanded restraint as much as resolve. He thought of the station again, the way release had felt like permission, the way permission had always been a trap. Valor settled, patient, trust unbroken. A presence that made Ryan confront a truth he had avoided since leaving the teams: responsibility did not end when orders did. He drove back toward the cabin by a longer route, checking mirrors, testing whether the city watched him as closely as he watched it. Snow began again, light and deceptive, softening edges without changing shapes. At the cabin, Ryan hid the drive where firelight would never find it and paced once, twice, a measured loop that kept his thoughts from scattering. He did not call anyone. Calls created trails. Instead, he laid out the night in his head. The harbor's lights, the schedules that did not bend, the likelihood that money had already purchased silence. Valor's quiet presence pressed at his side, not urging speed, urging accuracy. Ryan understood that tonight would not forgive mistakes, that moving too early or too late could cost lives, that the difference between rescue and disappearance often lived in minutes. He checked the door, then the window, then the drive again, committing its existence to memory as if memory could anchor fate. When he finally sat, the city's glow distant and cold, he allowed himself one steadying thought. The truth had a shape now, small enough to hold, sharp enough to cut, and it would not remain hidden simply because powerful people wished it so. A brittle winter evening closed in as police lights fractured the snow and the city tightened its grip, every street suddenly feeling narrower than it had an hour before. Ryan Carter parked 2 blocks from the station and finished the walk on foot, the USB hidden where habit and paranoia agreed it would not be found quickly. His pulse had slowed into something deliberate, the kind of calm that arrived not because fear was absent, but because fear had been counted and placed where it belonged. Valor stayed close, absorbing the tension like a living gauge, neither agitated nor relaxed, simply ready, and Ryan took a quiet measure of comfort from that steadiness. The station's doors opened to warmth and fluorescent certainty, the familiar smell of authority that promised order while quietly negotiating exceptions. Ryan asked to speak with the desk officer, stated plainly that he had information related to a missing child, and waited for the machinery to turn. Eyes lifted. Names were checked. A pause lingered too long. When the chief appeared, Ryan felt the shift before a word was spoken, the way air changed when a storm aligned itself just out of sight. The chief's gaze slid past Ryan, past Valor, to the room itself, as if measuring who might be listening. He spoke of protocols and proper channels, of protecting families and avoiding panic, of taking statements later. Ryan heard the cadence and understood the subtext immediately. This wasn't a refusal, it was containment. He said he needed to leave, that he would return with counsel, that the evidence could not wait. The chief smiled without warmth and nodded once. A uniformed officer stepped into Ryan's path, not touching him, just closing the geometry. Ryan felt the decision settle like a weight. He did not argue. He shifted his stance and said nothing, because silence sometimes forced the truth to hurry. It didn't. Hands reached for him. The room's noise thinned. Valor reacted before Ryan finished the thought, a sudden surge of motion that shattered the glass partition beside the desk in a spray of sound and confusion. Alarms bloomed, shouts overlapped. Ryan moved through the opening Valor created, not sprinting, not looking back, the old discipline carrying him through chaos without urgency. He burst into the cold and ran until the lights dulled behind him, breath burning, the city shedding him like a skin. He didn't stop until the car door closed and the engine answered, and only then did the cost land. In the mirror, he caught a glimpse of the mother being restrained near the entrance. Her fear sharpened into certainty, and the sight hit him harder than any blow. He told himself there would be time, that rescue sometimes required retreat. But the thought rang hollow even as it steadied his hands on the wheel. He turned into traffic without headlights for half a block, then blended into the flow, counting turns, choosing routes that confused pursuit rather than outran it. Sirens flared behind him, then faded, then returned farther off. The city conducting a search that felt performative rather than committed. Ryan's mind worked through possibilities, discarding the reckless ones, locking onto what remained. Someone wanted the evidence quiet. Someone had decided he was a variable to be removed or redirected. The question was how far that decision reached. The answer arrived sooner than he expected. At a four-way stop on the outskirts, a familiar vehicle eased into view, unmarked but known to him, and for a moment relief sparked before dying. The driver rolled down the window, voice raised just enough to carry, telling Ryan to pull over, to breathe, to let this be handled. It was the friend who had brought him in the first time, the one who had spoken of misunderstandings and paperwork. Ryan felt something tear, clean and final. He remembered late nights years ago, shared jokes, a promise that some lines mattered. He remembered how easily promises aged. He shook his head and drove on. The other car accelerated, not aggressive, not desperate, matching pace, blocking lanes with a confidence that said permission had been granted. Ryan cut the wheel sharply, tires biting snow, and the other car overcorrected, skidding just enough to open space. Ryan took it, heart steady, not angry anymore, just resolved. When the pursuit broke off a mile later, he knew it wasn't because they'd given up. It was because they'd learned enough. Back at the cabin, the night felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were listening. Ryan killed the engine and sat for a count of 10, letting the tremor pass. Valor pressed close, grounding him with contact rather than demand. Inside, Ryan moved fast and quiet, packing only what mattered, laying tools where muscle memory could find them in the dark. He checked the USB and felt a flash of relief that it was still there, intact, waiting. He considered calling for help and dismissed it. Calls left fingerprints. Trust was expensive. He thought of the mother again and forced the image aside, not because it didn't matter, but because letting it rule him now would lead to mistakes later. He paced once, then stopped, listening. Footsteps crunched outside, then retreated. A test, he thought. A reminder. Valor's ears angled, body still, a mirror of Ryan's own restraint. Minutes stretched. Ryan's thoughts returned to the friend in the car, to the way betrayal rarely announced itself as villainy. It wore concern, it wore reason, it wore the language of safety. He wondered how much money it took to turn caution into compliance, how many steps it took to convince yourself that doing nothing was the same as doing right. He did not indulge the anger for long. Anger clouded judgment. What remained was focus. He had a clock now, measured in departures and tides, and the margin was thin. The harbor lights flickered in his mind like coordinates. He imagined the ship easing away, the paperwork stamped, the silence settling over the city like fresh snow. He stood and met Valor's gaze, the understanding between them unspoken and complete. They would not win by being loud. They would win by being precise. As midnight approached, Ryan stepped outside and let the cold sharpen him. He looked back at the cabin once, a place that had been a refuge and was now a staging ground, and accepted that nothing would be the same after tonight. Somewhere beyond the trees, engines would start, schedules would be kept, and people who believed themselves untouchable would move pieces across a board they had designed. Ryan exhaled, steady, and turned toward the dark, knowing that escape had bought him time, and time had only one honest use. A bitter midnight wrapped the cabin in wind and creaking wood as the forest closed ranks and the clock shortened every decision to breath and muscle. Ryan Carter worked without ceremony, the way he had learned to work when hesitation killed more than bullets. The cabin ceased to be shelter and became function. Every object reassigned a purpose. Every sound weighed for meaning. He did not think about the station or the mother's eyes or the friend's betrayal, except as data points that narrowed his options to one clean line. Tonight was not about justice in the abstract. It was about interruption. Valor watched him move, absorbing intent, tracking the rhythm that said preparation rather than panic. The dog's loyalty pressed at Ryan's awareness like a steady hand between his shoulders, a reminder that fear could be held and used instead of obeyed. Ryan opened the floor panel and dropped into the cramped space beneath, the hidden room he had never planned to need but had refused to leave empty. He checked gear by touch, not sight, because light wasted time. He did not count weapons so much as capabilities. What could delay, what could divert, what could end a problem without drawing a crowd. He fitted protection to valor not as ornament but as necessity, hands gentle and efficient, murmuring nothing, trusting the dog to understand the seriousness without explanation. Valor accepted it with a stillness that felt like consent. Ryan's chest tightened at that. Consent had been stolen from too many people already tonight. He would not steal it from the one creature that had chosen him. The first impact came without warning, a concussion of sound that rattled the walls and rearranged the silence. Ryan was already moving, body aligning with angles he knew by heart. Shadows crossed the windows, boots on snow, voices clipped and purposeful. Not the men from before, not intermediaries. This was cleanup. Ryan waited until the second breach attempt, then acted, timing the response to the moment. Confidence turned to confusion. The fight was close and brutal and brief. He did not chase. He disrupted. He separated. He made the cabin a problem that demanded reconsideration. Valor moved with him, not wild, not reckless, understanding space and consequence, blocking lanes, forcing choices, creating openings. When Ryan took a hit and the pain flared white, he did not fall. He leaned into it, used it to stay present, the way pain had always anchored him when thoughts threatened to scatter. He drove the attackers back, not by defeating them entirely, but by convincing them that the cost would exceed the schedule. When the last shadow retreated into the trees, the forest swallowed them without comment. Ryan locked the door and stood still until his pulse slowed. Blood soaked his sleeve. He sat, exhaled, and did what had to be done without dramatics, hands steady, jaw set. Valor pressed close, a physical insistence that Ryan remain here, remain now. Ryan smiled once, a thin thing, and finished binding the wound. He did not allow himself the luxury of rest. Rest would ask questions he could not answer. He checked the clock and felt the harbor draw nearer in his mind, a tide pulling at him with mechanical certainty. He considered calling for help again and dismissed it. The last call had taught him the price of divided loyalty. If help came, it would have to come late, when the truth had no more room to hide. He gathered what he needed and left the rest, because carrying more than necessary was a form of fear. Outside, the wind sharpened his thoughts into points. He moved through the trees with Valor at his side, a quiet partnership shaped by urgency rather than words. The road waited, dark and forgiving. As he drove, The pain in his side pulsed in time with the engine, a metronome reminding him that speed would not buy accuracy. He adjusted, drove smooth, watched the edges. The city's lights grew, then thinned, then gave way to the industrial glow that marked the harbor's reach. Ryan parked where the snow hid tracks and watched the water breathe, the ship's silhouettes black against reflected light. He thought of schedules and signatures and the way evil preferred paperwork to force. He thought of the baby's cry and the mother's silence and the note that had turned gravity into direction. Valor stood with him, gaze fixed, sensing the gravity of the place without knowing its names. Ryan checked his wound again and tightened the wrap, accepting the dull ache as the price of staying in motion. He steadied his breath and allowed himself one clear truth. Tonight would end with doors opening or closing, with engines starting or stopping, with lives crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. He did not know which way the balance would tip, but he knew where he would stand. He took one last look back toward the trees, the cabin now just a darker patch of night, and then turned fully toward the harbor, ready to step into the narrow window where timing mattered more than courage. Dawn hovered over the harbor as wind cut across ice-black water. Floodlights carved hard shadows, and engines idled like impatient beasts, while Ryan Carter and Valor moved through snow and metal toward a schedule that would not wait. Ryan Carter kept low behind stacked pallets, the pain at his side pulsing in time with his breath, each throb a reminder that tonight's victory would not feel heroic, only necessary. The harbor was louder than the forest had been, yet the noise felt emptier, industrial and indifferent, as if the world here had trained itself not to listen for suffering. Valor stayed close without crowding, reading the space in the way only a creature forged by survival could, sensing where footsteps belonged and where they did not. Ryan's mind ran a steady loop of priorities, the evidence, the mother, the children, the ship. He could not save everything at once, so he chose the one outcome that changed all the others: stop the departure. He spotted the access road first, the choke point where vehicles funneled toward the pier, and he knew instinctively that a direct assault would end with sirens and bodies and a ship still slipping away under a different name. He needed disruption, not spectacle. He moved closer and caught fragments of conversation from dock workers who were not dock workers, the clipped cadence of hired security using civilian words to cover professional intent. Somewhere within that perimeter, the mother would be held as leverage, and somewhere nearby, the missing infant would be a symbol of ownership, a proof that power could reach into the helpless and pull out what it wanted. Ryan's chest tightened, not with fear, but with that sick blend of rage and restraint that came when he imagined a baby treated like paperwork. He saw the ship's gangway lit and ready, saw a van near a warehouse door, and recognized the logic of it. Quick transfer, minimal exposure, all movement justified by the chaos of winter. He was still calculating when the radio on his belt crackled, a frequency he had not used in months, a voice cutting through static with a tone that felt both amused and relieved. "You look like you could use a medic, buddy." The words hit him like warmth and shame at the same time. He did not answer immediately because he did not trust hope, not after the station, not after betrayal, not after realizing how easily systems bent. Then a second voice came through, calm and unmistakable, the kind of calm that had once meant safety in places where safety was rare. It was his old team lead, a man whose past included losses he never spoke about, losses that made his quiet more protective than distant. "Ryan, keep your head down. We're on site." Ryan exhaled and felt his vision sharpen. The relief was not soft. It was sharp, like finally removing a splinter that had been digging into nerve. Help had arrived, not because the world had grown kinder, but because the truth had finally become too heavy for one man to carry. The team moved in without theatrics, appearing like shadows that belonged, spreading across the pier with the economy of professionals who did not need to prove anything. Ryan's job became simple: hold position, stay alive, and tell them what he knew. He fed them the van location, the warehouse door, the likely path to the gangway, and they responded with a few clipped acknowledgments that sounded almost casual, but carried the weight of practiced coordination. Valor's attention lifted, sensing movement that was not threat, sensing the subtle shift when the predator's certainty begins to crack. Ryan thought of the first night, the stroller, the boot rising and falling, and he realized with a strange ache that Valor had done for him what his team was doing now, taking a hopeless situation and refusing to accept the outcome it was designed to produce. The takedown unfolded like a closing net. Security men turned, confused by shadows where shadows should not be, then dropped as control was applied with cold precision. A warehouse side door opened, and a woman was pulled into view by a handler whose grip was too tight to be protective. Ryan's throat tightened when he recognized the mother, her eyes wide with the exhausted terror of someone who had been punished for speaking. He started forward and felt Valor press lightly against his leg, a grounding reminder to wait for the right second. The team lead's voice came through again. Not yet. Ryan hated the restraint, even as he respected it. He had lived long enough to know that timing was mercy. A second later, the handler's arm was trapped, the grip released, the mother pulled free and guided behind cover by a medic who spoke to her in a steady tone meant to rebuild reality one sentence at a time. The van doors were forced, and inside were children, not all of them, but enough to make Ryan's stomach drop, small faces turned toward the dark as if darkness were normal. The team moved fast, transferring them toward warmth and medical care without letting the harbor become a stage. In the confusion, a man stepped into the light near the gangway, the billionaire father, the one who had shaken Ryan's hand at the station as if gratitude could erase suspicion. He raised his voice, tried to perform authority, tried to claim guardianship with words polished by money. No one listened. A federal agent newly arrived spoke the man's name and listed charges with a calm that did not negotiate. The billionaire's certainty collapsed into anger, then into bargaining, then into the kind of silence that comes when a person realizes influence does not work on everyone. Ryan watched him and felt no triumph, only a cold clarity. Evil often looks clean until it is forced into the light. Nearby, another figure was pulled from a vehicle, the police chief, face gray with dread, his loyalty bought and now worthless. The friend who had betrayed Ryan did not appear here, but Ryan understood that betrayal had a wide footprint, and that footprint would be mapped by people whose job was to follow money into its hiding places. The ship's engines cut out. The gangway remained, but the departure died on the pier, trapped by the simple truth that schedules do not outrun evidence. Someone recovered the USB from Ryan's hidden pocket with gloved care, treating it like a living thing. Ryan heard the word FBI in the air, heard the brisk procedural language that followed, and felt an odd distance from it all, as if his part had been to hold a door open long enough for a larger force to enter. He looked down at Valor, who stood steady amid the movement, not excited, not frightened, simply present, a guardian without a badge. Ryan knelt and rested a hand on the collar, feeling its cool metal against his fingers, and the memory of the stroller returned again, not as pain, but as proof that one choice could reroute an entire night. The team lead approached, glanced at the bandage on Ryan's side, and gave him a look that mixed reprimand with respect, the look of someone who had once been young and stubborn and lucky. "You did enough," the team lead said, and Ryan almost laughed at the understatement. Enough had nearly killed him. Enough had also saved lives. The mother was brought nearby, wrapped in a blanket, her hands shaking as she looked at the rescued children. She didn't thank Ryan with words at first. She simply looked at Valor, then at Ryan, and her expression changed from fear to something like fragile belief. Ryan wanted to tell her he was sorry it had come to this, sorry she had been alone so long, sorry the world had made her beg for safety. Instead, he said, "They're safe now." Because sometimes the simplest sentence is the only bridge a person can cross. Sirens approached, official and late, and the SEAL team began to disappear, not running, just folding back into anonymity, the way they always had, leaving the mess to the institutions that would now be forced to act. Ryan watched them go and felt the strange emptiness that followed adrenaline, the quiet after the storm's howl. By the time the sun lifted fully, the harbor looked almost ordinary, as if it hadn't been a crossroads for stolen lives a few hours earlier. The news cycle moved fast, but not fast enough to bury what had surfaced. Over the following days, names appeared in headlines, accusations, resignations, arrests, and the phrase "anonymous heroes" began to circulate like a myth people needed. Ryan did not read most of it. He healed in the way he always did, quietly, with discomfort and determination, letting the wound close and letting his mind catch up to what his body had survived. Weeks later, when the snow on the mountain ridge held firm under a clear sky, Ryan drove to a high overlook above the town, a place where the world looked small and consequences looked honest. He carried a folded newspaper, not because he craved recognition, but because he needed to see the story outside his own head to confirm it had really happened and had not been another hallucination of purpose. The headline spoke of a trafficking ring dismantled, of corrupt officials exposed, of children recovered. It did not mention him by name. It did not mention Valor at all. Ryan found that right, strangely comforting. Some guardians did their work and vanished, leaving only the fact that someone lived to see tomorrow. He sat in the snow, the cold seeping through his clothes, and Valor settled beside him, watching the horizon as if it could still produce threats. Ryan spoke softly, not to the sky, not to God, not to an audience, but to the only witness who had been with him at the beginning, when it was just a stroller, a boot, and a choice. "We weren't supposed to win," he said, "but you didn't move." Valor's ears twitched, a small acknowledgement. Ryan smiled, the first real smile in what felt like years, and the weight in his chest shifted into something like peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. He folded the newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and rested his hand once more on Valor's collar, the symbol of courage that had stopped being a symbol and become a truth. And for the first time since leaving the teams, Ryan Carter felt less like a man running from his past and more like a man walking toward a life he had chosen. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as a moment of courage, a choice made in the cold when walking away would have been easier. In a world that often feels broken, God still works through ordinary people, using wounded hearts, steady hands, and even loyal animals to protect the innocent. In our own lives, we may feel unseen, exhausted, or lost in the noise of daily struggles. But no act of love is ever wasted, and no stand for what is right goes unnoticed by heaven. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. And may His peace be with you and your family always.